The spotlight was still burning hot on the empty stage at the Memphis Coliseum. 15,000 fans were on their feet, screaming Elvis's name, but Elvis Presley was gone. Not just off stage, not just backstage. Gone, vanished. Security couldn't find him. His manager couldn't find him. Even his own bodyguards had no idea where he was. What they did know was this. 23 minutes earlier, Elvis had been in the middle of singing "Love Me Tender" when something happened that made him stop mid-verse, drop the microphone, and walk straight off the stage without a single word. The official story: Elvis felt sick, heat exhaustion. The newspapers ran with it the next morning. The king overwhelmed by Memphis heat. Complete fiction. Because 3 people in that arena knew the real truth about what broke Elvis Presley that night. 3 people who watched the most famous man in the world crumble like a child who just discovered that everything he believed about love was a lie. What happened in those missing hours would remain buried for over 4 decades. The recordings were sealed. The witnesses were silenced. Even Elvis's own family refused to speak about it. But secrets have a way of surfacing, especially when they involve the night that changed everything for the king of rock and roll. The night Elvis Presley discovered that the people closest to him had been planning something that would either save his soul or destroy it completely. This is that story. To understand what shattered Elvis Presley on that August night in 1977, you have to go back 24 hours earlier, to a phone call that arrived at Graceland on a Tuesday afternoon while Elvis was playing piano in his music room. Lisa Marie, only 9 years old, was curled up beside him on the piano bench, trying to pick out chopsticks with her tiny fingers. Elvis was laughing, making jokes, telling her stories about the old days when he was just a poor kid from Tupelo who dreamed of making music. Then the phone rang. Elvis almost didn't answer it. He was having one of those rare, perfect moments with his daughter, but something about the insistent ringing made him walk over and pick up the receiver. "Graceland." The voice on the other end said 5 words that would haunt Elvis until his final breath. "We need to talk tonight." Lisa Marie watched her father's face change. The color drained from his cheeks. His hand started trembling, and for the first time in her young life, she saw something in her daddy's eyes that terrified her, genuine fear. "Who was that, Daddy?" "Nobody, sweetheart, just business." But it wasn't business, and it definitely wasn't nobody. The voice belonged to Red West, Elvis's former best friend and bodyguard. The same Red West who Elvis had fired just months earlier in a fit of paranoia and hurt feelings. The same Red West who had sworn he would make Elvis pay for choosing pills over friendship. Red had been planning something for weeks, something that would force Elvis to face a truth he'd been running from. And tomorrow night's concert in Memphis was going to be the perfect stage for his revenge. See, what Elvis didn't know was that Red had been busy since his firing, very busy, making phone calls, recording conversations, gathering evidence, and reaching out to someone Elvis thought was safely tucked away in California, living her new life far from the chaos of Graceland. Priscilla Presley had been divorced from Elvis for 4 years by August of 1977. 4 years of trying to build a normal life for herself and Lisa Marie. 4 years of watching from a distance as the man she'd once loved destroyed himself with pills, paranoia, and the crushing weight of fame. She was living in a beautiful house in Beverly Hills, dating occasionally, trying to figure out who she was when she wasn't Elvis's wife. But there was something she'd never told anyone, not her friends, not her family, not even her therapist. She'd written a letter to Elvis 6 months earlier, a letter she'd written and rewritten dozens of times, a letter that said things she'd never been brave enough to say out loud, things about regret, about mistakes, about wondering if they'd given up too easily. The letter she'd written but never sent was about to surface in the most devastating way possible. Because Red West had gotten his hands on it. Don't ask me how, that's a story for another time, but he had it, and he knew exactly how to use it to break Elvis's heart at the precise moment when it would hurt the most. But Red wasn't the only one with secrets. Dr. George Nishapoulos, everyone called him Dr. Nick, had been Elvis's personal physician for years. The man who supplied the pills that kept Elvis functioning. The man who enabled every dangerous habit while telling himself he was helping. But Dr. Nick had his own agenda that August. He'd been growing increasingly worried about Elvis's mental state. The paranoia was getting worse. The pills weren't working like they used to, and Dr. Nick had started to realize that his patient wasn't just addicted to prescription drugs. He was addicted to pain. Emotional pain, the pain of a man who felt completely alone despite being surrounded by millions of fans. The pain of a father who was terrified he was failing his daughter. The pain of an ex-husband who was still desperately in love with a woman who had moved on without him. Dr. Nick knew Elvis's most guarded secret, and tonight he planned to use it. You see, Elvis had been having an affair. This wasn't unusual. Elvis had been with many women since his divorce, but this one was different. This wasn't just physical. This was emotional, deep, real. The woman was someone from his past, someone who understood the boy he'd been before the fame consumed everything good about him, someone who made him feel human again. Elvis thought it was his secret, his one source of joy in an increasingly dark world. He had no idea that Dr. Nick had been documenting everything, recording their phone calls, photographing their meetings, building a file that he planned to use to force Elvis into the psychiatric treatment he desperately needed. Because Dr. Nick had convinced himself that the only way to save Elvis was to threaten to destroy him. August 16, 1977, arrived hot and humid in Memphis. Elvis woke up in the afternoon, as usual, in his massive bed at Graceland, but something felt different, wrong, like the air itself was charged with electricity before a thunderstorm. He'd been having the dreams again, dreams about his mother, Gladys, who'd been dead for nearly 20 years. Dreams where she was trying to tell him something important, but he could never quite understand what she was saying. In the dream from that morning, she'd been standing at the gates of Graceland, tears streaming down her face, reaching through the bars like she was trying to warn him about something terrible that was coming. Elvis got dressed slowly, picking out one of his white jumpsuits for the evening's performance. The Memphis Coliseum was sold out, as always. 15,000 people who would scream his name and sing along to every word. People who saw him as larger than life, as someone who had everything anyone could ever want. If only they knew the truth. As Elvis prepared to leave for the venue, he had no idea that 3 separate plots were already in motion. Red West was already at the Coliseum, despite being banned from all Elvis events. Priscilla was boarding a plane from Los Angeles, carrying secrets that would shatter her ex-husband's world. And Dr. Nick was preparing a confrontation that would force Elvis to choose between his addiction and his sanity. The concert began like any other. Elvis took the stage at 8:30 sharp, looking magnificent in his white jumpsuit that caught the stage lights like diamond dust. The crowd went wild, as they always did. Flash bulbs popped. Women threw flowers and hotel room keys onto the stage. Elvis was energetic that night, more alive than he'd seemed in months. He was cracking jokes, telling stories, moving with that old hip-swiveling magic that had started it all 20 years earlier. But if you were watching closely, really watching, you might have noticed something. Every few songs, Elvis would glance toward the right side of the stage, like he was looking for someone, or waiting for something. His smile would falter for just a moment, and something anxious would flicker across his face. Then, during Hound Dog, a stagehand walked up to Elvis and handed him a folded piece of paper. Elvis read it, and for just a moment, his face went completely white, but he kept singing, he kept smiling, because Elvis Presley never broke character, never. Until 20 minutes later, when he did. The song he chose wasn't on the set list. Love Me Tender was supposed to be saved for the encore, but when Elvis looked out into the crowd and saw faces in the front row that he wasn't expecting, faces that made his heart stop and his world tilt sideways, he called for it anyway. Because sometimes, When your entire life is about to explode, all you can do is sing the truth. Elvis wasn't supposed to sing Love Me Tender that night. It wasn't on the set list that his band had rehearsed. It wasn't part of the carefully choreographed show that Colonel Parker had approved. But when Elvis Presley saw what he saw in the front row of the Memphis Coliseum, all the planning in the world went straight out the window. Because sitting there, just 20 feet from the stage, was Priscilla, his ex-wife, the mother of his child, the woman he'd been dreaming about every single night since their divorce 4 years earlier. But Priscilla wasn't alone. She was sitting next to a man Elvis had never seen before. A tall, distinguished-looking guy in an expensive suit who had his arm draped casually around her shoulders. And when Elvis looked closer, when his heart was already starting to crack, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The man sitting next to his ex-wife was wearing Elvis's own jewelry. The diamond ring Elvis had given Priscilla as a promise they'd always be family, no matter what happened between them as husband and wife. The ring she'd sworn she would never give to another man. Love me tender, love me true, Elvis began to sing, his voice already shaking with an emotion he was fighting to control. All my dreams fulfill. But his dreams weren't being fulfilled. They were being shattered, piece by piece, right in front of 15,000 witnesses. As Elvis sang, his mind raced back to that piece of paper the stagehand had given him during Hound Dog. He'd assumed it was a request from a fan or maybe a technical note from his sound crew. But when he'd unfolded it under the bright stage lights, he discovered something that hit him like a physical blow. The note wasn't from a fan. It was from his daughter, Lisa Marie, 9 years old and already wise beyond her years. The handwriting was careful, precise, the way children write when they're trying to say something really important. Daddy, why did you lie to me about Mama loving you? Elvis had read those words while playing guitar, while smiling at the crowd, while pretending everything was perfect. But inside, something fundamental had broken. Because Lisa Marie was right. He had been lying to her. He'd been telling his daughter that her parents still loved each other, that they were just living apart for a while, that maybe someday they'd be a real family again. But looking at Priscilla now, seeing her lean into this stranger, seeing her smile at him the way she used to smile at Elvis, it was clear that those were the desperate lies of a man who couldn't accept the truth. Meanwhile, backstage, Red West was watching everything unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and guilt. He'd orchestrated this whole thing down to the smallest detail. Getting Priscilla to Memphis hadn't been easy. It had taken weeks of careful manipulation, playing on her love for Lisa Marie and her concern for Elvis's deteriorating condition. Red had told Priscilla that Elvis was planning to make a public statement about their relationship during the concert, that he was going to embarrass her in front of thousands of people by begging her to come back. It wasn't true, of course, but it was enough to get her on a plane from Los Angeles. What Red hadn't told her was about the man he'd arranged to escort her to the show, a successful lawyer from California who'd been asking Priscilla out for months. Red had convinced him that this would be the perfect opportunity to make their relationship public, to show Elvis that Priscilla had truly moved on. But Red wasn't just orchestrating tonight's emotional ambush. He'd been building toward this moment for months. Ever since Elvis had fired him, Red had been gathering ammunition, recording phone conversations, documenting Elvis's pill usage, collecting evidence of behavior that could destroy the King's reputation forever. Red wasn't just leaking stories to tabloid reporters about Elvis's personal struggles. He was preparing to release something that would end Elvis's career, something so devastating that it would force Elvis to choose between getting help or losing everything he'd ever worked for. Because Red had been recording Elvis's most private moments, the conversations with his mystery woman, the late-night phone calls where Elvis would break down crying about losing Priscilla, the times when Elvis was so high he didn't even know what he was saying. Red had hours of tapes, dozens of them, enough to prove that Elvis Presley was not the man his fans thought he was, enough to destroy the legend forever. But as Red watched Elvis struggle through Love Me Tender, something twisted in his stomach. This wasn't supposed to be about cruelty. This was supposed to be about saving his friend's life, about forcing Elvis to wake up before it was too late. "Love me tender, love me dear," Elvis continued, his voice cracking on the word dear. "Tell me you are mine." But she wasn't his anymore, and everyone in that arena could see it. Priscilla, for her part, was dying inside. She hadn't wanted to come to Memphis. She'd been building a new life in California, trying to figure out who she was when she wasn't Elvis's wife. But when Red West had called her with warnings about Elvis's public humiliation plans, she'd felt she had no choice. What she hadn't expected was the letter she'd written to Elvis 6 months ago but never sent. The letter that Red had somehow gotten his hands on. The letter that said things she'd never been brave enough to say out loud. In that letter, she'd written about the loneliness, about wondering if they'd given up too easily, about the nights when she still reached for the phone to call him just to hear his voice, about how she still wore her wedding ring on a chain around her neck, hidden under her clothes where no one could see it. Red had read her that letter over the phone 3 days ago. Every word, every private thought, every confession she'd poured onto paper in a moment of weakness and vulnerability. "If you don't come to Memphis," Red had told her, "Elvis is going to read this letter on stage to 15,000 people, and to the reporters who'll be there covering the show." It was a lie. Elvis didn't have the letter. He didn't even know it existed. But Priscilla couldn't take that risk. She couldn't let her most private thoughts become tabloid headlines. So she'd come to Memphis, and she'd brought David, the lawyer, because Red had convinced her it would show strength, show that she'd moved on. But now, watching Elvis sing their song like it was a funeral dirge, she realized she'd walked into a trap. Not just Red's trap, but her own. Because seeing Elvis again, seeing the pain in his eyes, seeing how thin and fragile he looked, brought all those feelings rushing back. The feelings she'd been trying so hard to bury. "Love me tender, love me true, all my dreams fulfill," Elvis sang, looking directly at her now. And Priscilla saw something in his eyes that made her heart break. It wasn't anger, it wasn't accusation, it was just emptiness, like all the light had gone out of him. That's when she started to cry, not the gentle tears of nostalgia, but deep, body-shaking sobs that she couldn't control. Because in that moment, she realized the truth that Red had been counting on her to realize. She was still in love with Elvis Presley, had never stopped being in love with him. The divorce papers, the new life in California, the dating other men, it was all just elaborate pretending. And David, the lawyer sitting beside her, saw it too. He saw the way she was looking at her ex-husband. He understood, in that moment, that he was nothing more than a prop in someone else's drama. Elvis's voice cracked on the final line of the song, not from emotion, not from exhaustion. It cracked because in that moment, he realized that everything he thought he knew about his life, his family, his future, was a lie. The microphone hit the floor with a sharp electronic screech that made 15,000 people gasp in unison. And Elvis Presley walked straight off the stage, into the darkness of the wings, toward a man who had been waiting there with a bottle of pills and a promise that would send the king of rock and roll into the most dangerous 6 hours of his life. 11:47 p.m. That's the exact time when Elvis Presley's security detail realized their boss had vanished. His dressing room was empty. The famous white jumpsuit was hanging on a chair like the ghost of a performance that would never be finished. His keys were on the table. His wallet was in his jacket pocket, but Elvis himself was gone. The only thing missing besides Elvis was a bottle of pills from Dr. Nick's medical bag and a .45 caliber pistol that Elvis kept hidden in his guitar case. A gun that nobody was supposed to know about except Elvis and his head of security. Within minutes, Graceland was in chaos. Colonel Parker was making frantic phone calls to everyone from the Memphis police to the FBI. The media was already circling like vultures, sensing that something bigger than a cancelled concert was happening. Radio stations across the country were interrupting their regular programming with bulletins. "Elvis Presley has disappeared from his own concert. his whereabouts are unknown. But one person knew exactly where Elvis had gone. Nancy Rooks had been working as a maid at Graceland for over a decade. She'd cleaned up after Elvis's tantrums, his all-night recording sessions, his prescription pill binges. She'd seen him at his absolute worst and had never said a word to anyone about what went on behind those gates. 3 years earlier, Elvis had asked Nancy to do something strange. He'd given her a set of keys and an address downtown, a small apartment in an old building that nobody would ever think to look for the king of rock and roll. "This is my escape plan," he'd told her. "If the world ever becomes too much, if I ever need to disappear completely, this is where I'll go. Don't tell anyone about this place, Nancy, not Colonel Parker, not my daddy, nobody." It was Elvis's secret sanctuary, the place he'd go when the pills stopped working and the fame became unbearable, the place where he could just be a broken man instead of a legend. At 12:30 a.m., Nancy made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She called the apartment. Elvis answered on the first ring, like he'd been waiting by the phone. "Elvis, honey, everyone's looking for you. The police, the FBI, even your daddy's calling from Nashville." "I know, Nancy. I can hear the sirens from here." "Baby, you need to come home. Whatever happened tonight, we can fix it." There was a long pause. When Elvis spoke again, his voice was so quiet Nancy could barely hear him. "Some things can't be fixed, Nancy. Some things are broken forever." What Nancy didn't know was that Elvis wasn't alone in that apartment. Red West had found him there, just like Red had planned all along. But this wasn't going to be a reconciliation. This was going to be the final confrontation between two men who had once been closer than brothers. "You destroyed my family, Elvis," Red said, standing in the doorway of the small apartment. "Tonight, I'm returning the favor." Elvis was sitting on the edge of a bed that had seen better days, still wearing his stage clothes, but with the jumpsuit unzipped down to his waist. The bottle of pills was open on the nightstand next to him. The gun was in his lap. "You want to destroy me, Red? Go ahead. Seems like everyone I ever loved is already doing a pretty good job of it." That's when Red pulled out the cassette player, the same kind of portable recorder that journalists used for interviews, the same kind that had been sitting hidden in Elvis's private phone booth at Graceland for the past 6 months. "Before you do anything stupid with that gun, Elvis, I want you to hear something." Red pressed play. Elvis's own voice filled the small apartment, but it wasn't Elvis singing, it wasn't Elvis performing, it was Elvis talking to someone on the phone in the middle of the night, someone whose voice was also on the recording. A woman's voice, soft, southern, familiar. It was Sandra, Elvis's childhood friend from Tupelo, the girl who'd known him before the fame, before the money, before everything went wrong. They'd been having an affair for 8 months. Secret phone calls, secret meetings, secret plans to run away together and start over somewhere nobody would ever find them. Elvis thought it was his one pure thing in a life that had become corrupted by pills and paranoia and people who wanted pieces of him. Sandra was his connection to the boy he used to be, before the world decided he belonged to everyone except himself. But Red had been recording everything. "You recorded our phone calls," Elvis said, his voice flat with disbelief. "Every single one, for 6 months. You talking about leaving Priscilla for good. You talking about faking your own death so you could disappear with Sandra. You talking about abandoning Lisa Marie because you're too messed up on pills to be her father." Elvis's hands were shaking now, not from the pills, from rage. "You talking about how you never really loved Priscilla," Red continued. "How you only married her because Colonel Parker thought it would be good for your image. How the whole thing was just an act for the cameras." That last part hit Elvis like a physical blow because it was true. At least, it had been true when he'd said it to Sandra during one of their late-night conversations. When he was high and angry and saying things he didn't really mean just to justify the affair. But hearing his own words played back to him now, Elvis realized how they would sound to anyone else, how they would sound to Priscilla, how they would sound to Lisa Marie when she was old enough to understand. I have 47 hours of recordings, Elvis, enough to prove that America's golden boy is nothing but a drug-addicted liar who abandoned his family for a woman from his past. Red leaned forward, his voice cold as winter. So here's the deal. You have until sunrise to make a choice. Walk away from music forever. Check yourself into a psychiatric hospital. Get clean. Become the man Lisa Marie deserves as a father. Or I release every tape to every tabloid in America. Elvis looked at the gun in his lap. For a moment, the apartment was completely silent except for the sound of sirens in the distance, still searching for him. And if I choose the hospital, then I burn the tapes, all of them. Nobody ever has to know about Sandra or the pills or the things you said about Priscilla. You get to keep your reputation. Lisa Marie gets to keep her hero for a father. At 2:30 a.m., Elvis made a decision that surprised even Red West. I'll do it. I'll check into the hospital tomorrow. I'll quit performing. I'll get clean. It was exactly what Red had been hoping to hear. The intervention had worked. Elvis was finally going to get the help he needed. But then Red made a mistake. He pushed too far. There's one more thing, Elvis. You have to call Sandra tonight and end it. While I'm listening, I want to hear you break her heart the same way you broke Priscilla's. That's when Elvis picked up the gun. Not to hurt Red, not to hurt himself, but to smash the cassette player into 1,000 pieces. You want to save me, Red? Then you're going to have to trust me to save myself. At 4:47 a.m., Elvis Presley made a decision that he thought would save his daughter's innocence and his own legacy. He agreed to Red's terms. He was going to quit music forever. He was going to get help. But then someone else walked through that apartment door. Someone neither Elvis nor Red was expecting. Someone who would change everything about what happened next. The person who walked in would force Elvis to realize that sometimes the people who love you most are willing to break your heart, so they can save your soul. The door to the apartment opened so quietly that neither Elvis nor Red heard it at first. They were too caught up in their confrontation, too focused on the shattered pieces of the cassette player scattered across the floor and the weight of the decision that had just been made. But then a small voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Daddy!" Elvis's head snapped up, and his heart nearly stopped. Standing in the doorway, wearing her pink pajamas and clutching a stuffed animal, was Lisa Marie, 9 years old, barefoot, with tears streaming down her cheeks. "Baby girl, what are you doing here? How did you?" "I followed Uncle Red's car," she said, walking into the apartment like she owned the place. "I heard him on the phone earlier. I know he's trying to hurt you." Red West went pale. He'd been so focused on his plan to save Elvis that he'd never considered the possibility that an innocent child might get caught in the crossfire. "Lisa Marie, sweetheart, you shouldn't be here," Red said, his voice suddenly gentle. "This is grown-up business." But Lisa Marie ignored him completely. She walked straight to her father and climbed onto his lap, wrapping her small arms around his neck. "Daddy, I heard what Uncle Red said about the tapes. I heard what he wants you to do." Elvis felt his world tilt sideways. "Honey, you don't understand what's happening here." "Yes, I do," Lisa Marie said, pulling back to look him directly in the eyes. "I know about Sandra." The silence in the apartment became deafening. Both men stared at the little girl in absolute shock. "I've known for months, Daddy. I heard you talking to her on the phone sometimes when I was supposed to be sleeping. And you know what? I don't care." Elvis's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Baby, And I know you said mean things about Mama, but I also know you didn't mean them. Because last week, when you thought I wasn't listening, I heard you crying and telling Sandra that you still love Mama more than anything in the world." Lisa Marie reached into her pajama pocket and pulled out something that made both men gasp. It was a small cassette tape. "I made my own recording, Daddy, of you telling Sandra that you wish you could fix things with Mama. Of you saying that leaving us was the biggest mistake of your life. Of you saying that you'd give up everything, the music, the fame, all of it, just to be a real family again. Red stared at the little girl in amazement. Lisa Marie, how did you? I'm not stupid, Uncle Red. I know how to use a tape recorder, and I know that sometimes grown-ups say things they don't mean when they're sad and confused. She turned back to Elvis, her voice becoming softer but more serious than any 9-year-old should ever have to sound. Mama still loves you, Daddy. She told me yesterday when she called from the airport. She said she was coming to Memphis because she needed to tell you something important. Elvis felt something crack open in his chest. What did she say, baby? She said she made a mistake. She said that man she brought to your concert isn't her boyfriend. He's her lawyer. She was going to ask him to help her write you a letter about wanting to try again. The room fell completely silent, except for the sound of Elvis's sharp intake of breath. She was scared you didn't want her anymore because you never called or wrote letters. But I told her you cry about her all the time. I told her you keep her picture next to your bed and you talk to it sometimes when you think nobody's watching. Red West felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. His entire plan, his months of manipulation and recording and scheming had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding. Priscilla hadn't moved on. The man at the concert wasn't her new love. She'd been just as lost and confused as Elvis. Lisa Marie, Red said quietly, why didn't you tell anyone this before? Because grown-ups are dumb sometimes, she said matter-of-factly. They make everything more complicated than it has to be. Mama loves Daddy, Daddy loves Mama, they both love me. The only reason they're not together is because they're too scared to tell each other the truth. Elvis looked down at his daughter, this wise little soul who had somehow managed to see through all the lies and manipulation and pain to the simple truth underneath. Uncle Red, Lisa Marie said, turning to face the man who had orchestrated the evening's drama, you don't need those tapes to save my daddy. You just need to help him be brave enough to call Mama. At 5:30 a.m., with his daughter curled up in his lap and Red West looking sheepish in the corner, Elvis Presley picked up the phone in that small apartment and dialed a number he knew by heart. Priscilla answered on the second ring. Elvis. Silla, his voice broke. I need to tell you something. The conversation that followed was awkward and painful and beautiful and real. Elvis told her about Sandra, about the affair, about the things he'd said that he didn't mean. Priscilla told him about the lawyer, about the letter she'd written, about how seeing him on stage had made her realize she'd never stopped loving him. They talked for 47 minutes, about their mistakes, their fears, their hope that maybe it wasn't too late to try again. At 6 a.m., Elvis walked back into the Memphis Coliseum. The crew was still there, cleaning up after the night's chaos. He took the microphone from the abandoned stage and sang Love Me Tender to an empty arena. But this time, he finished the song. Those 6 missing hours weren't just Elvis running away from his problems. They were Elvis learning that sometimes the people who love you most are the ones willing to break you down so they can help build you back up. Red West had been wrong about a lot of things that night, but he'd been right about one. Elvis needed to face the truth. The truth wasn't in the recordings or the secrets or the scandals. The truth was in the voice of a 9-year-old girl who loved her parents enough to save them from themselves. Elvis Presley died exactly 1 year later on August 16, 1978. But those who knew him best say that the real Elvis, the father, the man, the human being was reborn in that apartment at 4:47 a.m. Because sometimes you have to completely disappear to finally find yourself. If Elvis had lived to tell this story himself, would he have been brave enough? Or would he have taken these secrets to his grave like so many other stars who couldn't handle the weight of being human? The people who love us most sometimes have to hurt us to save us. Has that ever happened in your life? Tell me in the comments, because everyone deserves a guardian angel, even if they're only 9 years old.